Hello, everyone. Something that I want to talk to you about today is the manner in which hierarchies of attention make themselves manifest in Western classical music. Recently, I've been thinking a lot about which notes are really important for interpretation and for communicating meaning through a piece of music. There's a danger as interpreters to try to make all of the notes of equal importance in a texture, but the risk of doing that is that one, it will severely slow down the learning process, because if everything is brought up to the same level of detail, it just takes much longer to go through the process of learning a piece. But also beyond that, it becomes more difficult to communicate musical meaning, because if everything is equally important, then there's no way to discern what you're really supposed to listen to. As both a performer as well as a teacher, it's important to understand which notes are really important so that meaning can be communicated. And I thought I would talk about some thoughts that I have about how to discern which notes are truly important, both as a performer and as a listener of Western classical music. Several months ago, there was a podcast by Jonathan Pageau that I listened to where he talked to a woman named Heather Pollington about the way that hierarchies of attention are used in order to communicate meaning in film. And one of the major takeaways that I got from that podcast was that there's gradations of detail throughout the structure of a shot and throughout the structure of a film overall, where the things that are in the center, like the main characters and then the props that they interact with, have the highest amount of detail associated with them. And as you go further and further out to the side characters and the side props, or the very far background characters and their props, or even the very, very far background environment, that level of detail and planning becomes more and more obscure as it goes throughout the structure of a shot. So what's in the center has the highest amount of detail, and then what's secondary has a slightly less amount, what's tertiary has an even less amount, and then what's in the very far background has the least amount of detail of everything. And so with that kind of a structure, we know what to pay attention to, and we know what's really important in the story. And by knowing what's important in the story, we're able to understand the meaning of a film and to participate in the lives and the experiences of the main characters. Now, listening to that podcast, it got me thinking that maybe these hierarchies of attention aren't only to be found in films, but maybe they're to be found in other forms of art, and hopefully even classical music. So I'm going to use the example of a novel in particular, in the way that hierarchies of attention are manifest in a novel, so that I can explain the hierarchies that are made manifest in classical music. Novels work in a similar way to films, with the concentric rings of attention that have the highest amount of detail to the middling detail to lesser detail to hardly any detail at all. In the very center, with the most amount of detail in the novel, we have the main characters, their lives and their experiences. I think especially in a first-person novel, we see the entire world through that main character's eyes, and we come to know who the main character is, what they're desiring, what they're moving towards, much more than we come to know anything else. At the secondary level, outside of the main character, we have side characters who are fairly fleshed out with backgrounds and motivations of their own, but they exist to buttress the main character's stories and to offer different perspectives, to either offer help or conflict. And even though their lives and their stories may not be quite as detailed as the main character's story, they nevertheless play an essential role in enriching the story of the main character. And ironically, sometimes side characters actually have become much more interesting than main characters. It's not a novel, but I think Darth Vader in Star Wars or Prince Zuko in The Last Airbender are excellent examples of that. Now, beyond the level of the side characters, you have the setting, which the setting that a story takes place in and the setting that a main character moves through plays a pretty significant part in our understanding of who that character is and what the story is, because it provides the boundaries for which the main character can operate in, that without those boundaries it would change everything about a character's motivation and his direction in a story. This is maybe a bit of a ridiculous example, but if we were to take Tony Soprano and to put him in Middle-earth, he would become a very different character, and of course the way he was written, he'd be entirely out of place. In the same manner, if you were to put Gandalf and make him one of the many saints of Newark, then he would become an entirely different character as well. So the settings that a character is placed in has an immense amount of influence over who that character is, and in many cases a setting can even become like a character itself, with its own spirit and with its own kind of contextual motivation. Beyond the setting, I think that there's also one final level where things kind of break down, and well, they break down in detail and they open the reader up to a broader possibility, so they engage the reader in an imaginative way that allows them to participate firsthand in the story through the use of their own imagination. And it's also this very external level which becomes the last level of definition before it breaks out into the world at large, and then the confines of the novel are lost. So what exists at that very external edge can change, but I like to think of characters who don't have a lot of backstory, but nevertheless invite quite a lot of speculation on the side of the audience. I think Tom Bombadil in The Lord of the Rings is a great example of this, because he's described as this powerful, important figure who lives in the woods. But Tolkien never explains who he really is, and never gives a full backstory on who Tom Bombadil is, and he never comes back into the story ever again. So this ambiguity and this mystery that surrounds Tom Bombadil invites the reader to make use of their own understanding of the world and their own understanding of Tolkien's work in order to make informed guesses and informed speculations on who this Tom Bombadil is. So, in a strange way, it's in the very lack of detail that makes Tom Bombadil such an interesting figure. And because of that lack of detail and the way that he inspires readers to take their own worldly perspective and apply it to who that character might be, Tom Bombadil also becomes the gateway through which the larger world is brought into the story of the Lord of the Rings. So those characters that exist on the edge, those details that exist on the edge, they're the last boundary between the novel as such versus the entire world. But if they're handled correctly, it also can make the story feel much larger than what is contained in the book itself, because it connects what is contained in the story of a novel to the entire world of experience for all of the readers who read it. So within novels, you have main characters in the center, followed by side characters, followed by the setting, followed by those characters on the fringe. And then all of that is surrounded by the world as such. You know, Western classical music follows a very similar hierarchy. And what's important to consider is that the human voice, or melodic lines that mimic the human voice, are at the center of the hierarchy of Western classical music. And so a big reason for that is because the classical music stemmed from the music of the early church, and the music of the early church was entirely vocal. So what you have at the center of the hierarchy in Western classical music are, with singing, with operas, with songs written for voice and accompaniment. That's really clear that the human voice is in the center of everything. But even with instrumental works, like with the piano, the voice that mimics the human voice and mimics a melody that would be sung is what's at the center of everything. And I think that can be compared to a main character in a novel. So it's important to find voices that mimic the human voice and to focus on those, because those are going to be at the center of attention. Now, zooming out from that, you also have contrapuntal lines, which kind of work like main characters. Excuse me. You have contrapuntal lines which work like side characters in a novel, and the contrapuntal lines they're melodies that work in counterpoint to a main melody, where if you have a main melody that mimics the human voice in the center, that has the highest amount of detail, the highest amount of direction, then the contrapuntal lines are like little sub-melodies that on their own they would be good enough to be melodies, but they exist lower in the texture than the main voice. And with that, their purpose is to enrich the melodic journey that the main voice is going on, and they work in a very similar manner to how side characters in a novel work, where side characters are there to enrich the story, to provide tension or to provide relief for the main character. And contrapuntal voices very much do the same thing. At the tertiary level, you have harmonies, which are like the setting of a novel. And just like the way that a novel's setting can change the purpose and direction of the main characters in that novel, the way that a composer harmonizes his melodies can also change the mood and the atmosphere and the direction of a piece of music. So if the central voice is the melodic line that mimics human singing, and that's like the main character, and the contrapuntal lines are like the side characters in a story, then again the harmony is the setting that provides the emotional context and direction and the confines around the main vocal lines or the main characters. Outside of the harmonic level, which is like the setting of a piece of music, then you also have the rhythmic and ornamental voices, and these voices exist very deep in the texture, and you have to be very careful with them because if they are played too loudly or with too much emphasis, it can ruin the entire structure of things, because they could very easily rise up and overpower everything else. But also if they're played correctly with the right amount of emphasis, and then they maintain their role properly on the fringe in the structure, then they can provide quite a lot of energy and quite a lot of motion and direction within a piece. So the rhythmic and ornamental voices can be compared to side characters like Tom Bombadil because they exist on the fringe, and their purpose is to provide a sense of motion and a sense of depth to a piece of music that would otherwise be lacking without it. I think for a good example of those kind of directional notes, Chopin's Revolutionary Etude is a good thing to listen to, because the left-hand figuration is very much entirely consistent of those notes which exist to provide propulsion and direction to a piece, while not necessarily being necessary for the harmonic changes or for the melodic development of that piece. Now, outside of all of that, you have silence, and silence both surrounds all sound and is within all sound. So silence is around everything that is produced and within everything that is produced. So in order to interpret things well, silence always has to be taken into consideration. So in a nutshell, the hierarchy of attention within classical music is that in the center you have a melodic voice which mimics the human voice, and it's like the main character in a story. It's the means through which we understand the meaning and direction of the piece of music. And it needs to have the highest amount of detail and the highest amount of thought being put into it in order to communicate musical meaning. Outside of that, you have contrapuntal lines, which are side melodies which buttress and enrich the main melody. And they exist at a lower level of detail, but are nevertheless close enough to the center that they also have to be fairly detailed. So they're like the side characters in a novel. At the tertiary level, you have the harmonies, which provide the musical setting for a main melody and the side melodies. And the harmony is like the setting in a novel, because the harmonies that you use will change the emotional significance and the atmosphere of a piece, and it will change the direction that the main melodies and side melodies take and the direction that you're going based on the harmonies that are chosen along each step of that main melody's path. Beneath the level of the harmony, surrounding everything, which is on the fringe, is the rhythmic and ornamental notes, which, although they aren't melodies in themselves, they don't necessarily do anything to add to the harmony and the harmonic development of the piece. They nevertheless add a sense of direction and a sense of motion to a piece that would otherwise be lacking without them. And then beyond everything, you have the silence that encompasses all sound. And that is more or less the hierarchy of attention that is manifest in Western classical music. At the center is the human voice, or the line that mimics it. Then the contrapuntal voices are at the second level. Then surrounding those is the harmonic voices and the harmonies. Around those, at one more level, are the rhythmic and ornamental voices. And surrounding everything is the silence that contains all sound.